Hey everybody in YouTube, this is Jackie Luqman, and I apologize for the repeated delays, but man, we've just been having a really difficult time with our tech. Please bear with us while we get some things straight. I just had to do a straight live stream to YouTube, and I am hoping that the audio is good. We're going to have to completely reconfigure everything to make sure we get everything that we want in these broadcasts, because we don't want to lose you guys, and we want to be able to keep doing this. So thanks for your patience. I really, really appreciate it. Sorry about all the tech issues. Happens sometimes. We're going to figure that out. Some things changed with YouTube and Facebook. We think we haven't figured out quite what those things are yet. But we are going to keep doing this, and we're going to keep working on it until we get it right. So, hey, whoever is watching, let me know if you can hear okay, if the video is good, looks good on my end. I'm hoping that the audio is okay. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to hop on. Just to remind people to share this video, because we're going to talk about this immigration crisis business and what it means to Black people, because it does mean something to us. And it's not what people might think, actually. I've been hearing quite a bit of rumblings from Black people, not all Black people, but some, about how they don't care about this immigration crisis. This isn't a problem that Black people need to focus on. And the other troubling narrative that I'm hearing from some Black people is that immigrants are the cause, or immigrants are making unemployment among Black people worse. So we shouldn't care what happens to immigrants. And I want to talk about those two things tonight. But I want to remind people to subscribe to us here on YouTube, to please follow us on Facebook. We should be on Twitter more, but that's just too much to deal with. Every Friday at 4:30, we have a weekly segment on Loud and Clear Radio, which is on Sputnik Radio. It airs at 4:30 p.m. We talk about midterm politics, and that's all we talk about on Fridays. How you doing, Veronica? Let me know if the audio is good. We do this broadcast. We try to do it on Thursdays at 9 p.m. Because we've been so busy, we've been kind of going back and forth with the date and the time, but we're going to try to stick to Thursdays at 9 p.m. Check us out also on Spreaker great. Thank you, Veronica. Check us out also on Spreaker on most Saturday nights between 9:30, when you can tune in to Pitbull and Politics. And check our Friends of Coffee, Current Events, and Politics page for lighter fare, and also Pitbull and Politics on Facebook. Okay, let's talk about this immigration crisis issue, whatever you want to call it. So the two troubling narratives that we hear, that I've been hearing, and I want to first say, if anybody thinks that this show is about any particular person, it's not. I live around Black people. I work around some Black people. I travel and I encounter Black people. So I hear all kinds of things. I go to church with Black people. So I hear all kinds of things from all kinds of different people in different places. This broadcast is not about any one particular person and what they've said and their views, any one particular person's views on this issue. So don't respond with, well, this person says this, that, and the third, and this is their information. I'm not interested in what any one particular person has to say. I'm interested in addressing these particular narratives that I've been hearing from some Black people about this immigration issue. Now, the first narrative that's been really bothering me that I've been hearing from some Black people is that the immigration issue makes Black unemployment worse. It's already bad enough, and immigrants make unemployment worse for Black people because immigrants take jobs away that would have gone to Black Americans. Now, I've not only heard this from some Black people, not a lot, but a couple, but I've also heard it from conservatives, right? From white conservatives and from a couple Black conservatives who really want to convince Black people that immigrants are our problem. So here's the problem with that narrative. Discrimination against Black people, especially Black men, has gone on since before federal immigration laws even existed. And we're talking about since Reconstruction, after the Civil War, because Black men were always targeted by law enforcement, lynch mobs. They were the last hired, first fired, kept out of unions, paid less than white men for the same job with the same level of education, same experience, seriously since Reconstruction. So Black men in particular, Black women also, but Black men in particular, being left out of the employment market intentionally, that's not something that immigrants did. It's not something that immigrants caused, and it's not something that immigrants or immigration made worse. Because of the white supremacist, racist society we live in and the racist practices of employers, Black men have been intentionally left out of the job market, much more than Black women have been. Now, it's absolutely true that Black women face discrimination also in employment, but unemployment rates between Black men and Black women are not equal. Black men's unemployment rate is much worse than Black women's, and Black men's income is much lower compared to white men than Black women's income compared to white women. It is absolutely true that Black women are paid less than white women for the same job, with the same level of experience, with the same level of education. Absolutely true. But Black men fare much, much worse, even worse than Black women in the American employment market. That is before any immigrant being offered a job or coming across the border legally or illegally is ever taken into account. As a matter of fact, the jobs that most immigrants take, people weren't offering them to Black people in the first place. We were already being discriminated against. Immigrants have not made that worse. The Black unemployment rate has also been twice as high as the national unemployment rate consistently for more than 50 years, almost as long as the Department of Labor has actually been collecting the data on unemployment rates. Again, that's not something that immigrants caused. That's not something that immigrants make worse. That is a concerted effort by American employers at every level to intentionally lock Black people out of the employment market. That is something that American companies and hiring managers do. And it's been proven to be consistent, like I said, for the past 50 years. That is even true currently, because people are talking about now how the unemployment rate is so low, and especially it's so low for African Americans. Well, remember when the unemployment rate was falling during the Obama administration? And look, we are no fans of President Obama. We are fans of facts, though. Because when the unemployment rate was falling under President Obama, which is when it started, all the conservatives were dismissing the lower unemployment rates by saying, well, what about all the people who have dropped out of the job market? What about all the people who aren't even being counted anymore because they can't find a job that's full time that pays a living wage, so they've just stopped looking? Well, those questions are still valid. Those questions are still valid in today's employment market with even lower unemployment numbers. Again, the drop in the unemployment rate started under Obama. And those questions still need to be asked, because among Black people, the unemployment rate is still twice as high as the national unemployment rate. It's twice as high as your average American. That's not something that immigrants are doing. American employers are still intentionally not hiring Black workers, something they have consistently done for the past 50 years. And more Black people who have been unemployed over a long period of time have dropped out of the job market, are not being counted, or they cannot find full-time jobs. They have part-time jobs. They want full-time work, but they can't find it, so they're not counted. Seasonal employees are not counted. They're counted in a separate study, in a separate group of statistics from the Department of Labor. So yes, we do have to look at, even in the face of these really low unemployment numbers, we absolutely have to look at the long-term unemployed, the seasonal workers, the part-time workers, the workers who want full-time work and can't get it. And even with the lower unemployment rate for Black workers, that has not translated into an increase in Black income, and it has not translated into an increase in Black wealth, which is another reason I know that immigration and immigrants are not the problem. And they're not making Black unemployment worse, because if unemployment among Black people is so low, and that means Black people are still are actually getting more jobs, or more Black people are getting jobs than before, we already established that's problematic, because of the long-term unemployed, the people who aren't even looking for work anymore because they haven't been able to find it, can't find full-time work. Well, if all of these more Black people are employed, why haven't Black people made more income? You know why? Because Black people are historically paid less money for the same job, regardless of level of education, regardless of years of experience, paid less money on average than white people for the same job. This has historically been true since the Department of Labor has been tracking this information. So is it the immigrants' fault that even in the face of a lower unemployment rate, Black people's income level hasn't risen? With these low unemployment numbers, we haven't chipped away at the racial income gap? Is it the immigrants' fault that with these low unemployment numbers, we haven't chipped away at the racial wealth gap? Are immigrants taking our money? Both can't be true, right? Immigrants can't be taking jobs that Black people would have gotten at the same time that unemployment is historically at an historically low rate for Black people, at the same time that Black people are looking for full-time work and can't find it, or have dropped out of the job market and not being counted, or are seasonal workers and don't work a full 12 months anyway. All of those things can't be true at the same time. So I'm thinking that immigrants really need to be taken out of this equation when we are looking at employment opportunities for Black people in this country. Immigrants aren't affecting our unemployment, our chronic underemployment, the racial income gap, or the racial wealth gap. Those things are not impacted by immigrants and immigration because those jobs weren't offered to Black people in the first place, the jobs that immigrants eventually get. So then let's talk about those jobs that immigrants do get. Because we're talking about American employers who, again, we just established, don't hire Black people anyway, especially not Black men. The jobs that immigrants do get are heavy labor in a lot of places. We all know that the migrant farm labor that is heavily dependent upon immigrant labor. These jobs pay many times less than minimum wage. Some don't. Some pay quite well, but some do pay less than minimum wage. There are no benefits, and the working conditions are horrendous. And American employers do this because they know that immigrants are a vulnerable population, and they can do this to immigrants. You see, they know that a lot of Black workers might take the jobs if they pay well enough because, see, we're born here. But see, they never offered the jobs to us. They wouldn't hire us. I guarantee you all of these jobs that people claim immigrants are taking from Black people have applied for those jobs. I have never in my life seen a job fair of any kind, or a store that opened, or somebody who was looking for somebody to do some work for them where Black people didn't go and apply for those jobs. I've never seen it not happen. I've never seen a big box store in this area, or a hotel, or a shopping mall, or a retail outlet that did not have hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants on job fair and hiring days. And I've lived in DC since I was 6 years old. The unemployment rate among Black men, young Black men in this city, in Southeast DC, in wards 7 and 8, Southeast, Northeast, the poorest and most predominantly Black areas of the city, easily 45% among young Black males. But these are the same people that people say don't want to work, and claim that it's the immigrants' fault because the immigrants are taking the jobs that should have gone to these people. But when these people apply for these jobs, they don't get hired. And let's scratch these excuses about people don't know how to interview. How do you need to interview for a construction job as a laborer? There's no special magic that you need. You don't need to wear a suit and a tie to go down to the construction trailer and fill out an application to be a laborer. I've seen young Black men go to a construction site in this neighborhood, fill out applications, and then when the work actually starts, almost all the people who are laborers on the site are non-Black Hispanic. That's not the fault of the non-Black Hispanic workers. That's the fault of the employer, who refused to hire qualified Black workers who live in the neighborhood. DC is not the only place this happens. This is on the employers, who will throw the applications of Black job seekers in the trash in favor of non-Black Hispanic or other immigrant workers because they know they can pay them less money. That's not the immigrants' fault. Those people are being exploited, and that's not right. But we are being exploited also because we are being discriminated against. And that is the sole responsibility of American employers. But conservatives and some other people, I can't entirely blame conservatives. People who want to make this about immigrants taking American jobs away are doing this for the sole purpose of taking the focus of Black people off of the people who are actually responsible for our economic dilemma, crisis, our own economic crisis in this country, and that's American employers and the system of white supremacy and persistent racism that we experience in the employment market to this day. A discrimination that we have always experienced, that we've experienced before immigrants from Latin and Central America even came here en masse. But let's talk about when that was. Mosquitoes out in our backyard have been tearing me up. Let's talk about when this immigration from Latin and Central American countries started, because this other narrative that I'm hearing from some Black people who say that they don't care what happens to immigrants at the border because it doesn't have anything to do with Black people. I am afraid that people who say that don't understand U.S. domestic and foreign policy and how policies that impact us also created the immigration crisis. So, but let's talk about immigration in the first place, just as a general idea. Federal immigration laws didn't actually exist in the United States until 1965. Let me rephrase that. In 1885, I think, the Chinese Exclusion Act and other kinds of these non-European people can't come here laws were passed by the federal government. But other than those kinds of racist laws, there really was no federal immigration policy that restricted preferred European immigration to the United States until 1965. Why is that important? In this whole debate about immigration and Central and Latin American or brown people coming up from the southern region and trying to cross the southern border into America, the reason this is such an interesting discussion coming from some people who really don't like brown people immigrating to this country is that from 1500 to 1965, literally from the first colonies to 1965, European immigrants were basically allowed to come into this country whenever the heck they wanted, however the heck they wanted. There is no group of people who came here from any country in Europe between 1500 and 1965 who had to have papers, documentation, who were considered illegal aliens when they came here from the old country. Unless people are Native Americans or are the natural-born descendants of African slaves, everybody else who came to this country before 1965 were almost all of them undocumented immigrants. All of them. With the exception of a few groups of people, like the Chinese, everyone who came to this country before 1965, especially if they came from Europe, all undocumented. So I think it's rich that all of these white people who are the descendants of those undocumented immigrants, now have a problem with brown undocumented immigrants. It's amazing to me how the European undocumented immigrants, people say, and I listen to white people who say, well, my parents came here the right way. My grandparents came here the right way. Your grandparents came here in the cargo hold of a ship next to some goats and the furnace. Your grandparents and their brother and everybody in their family, they could scrape up enough money to pay for that steerage ticket from Poland, from Ireland, from Italy, from Germany, from France. Well, not too many people wanted to leave France. From England, from Russia. All the papers these people needed from 1500 to 1965 was the money that it cost them for that ticket. When Ellis Island was established as the major immigration port in the 1800s, people still didn't really need documentation. They could have it. They'd have their birth certificate with, their country of origin and their birth name. But it wasn't a requirement. Nobody was turned away at Ellis Island because they didn't have papers. They were just given another name. That was written down. Country they came from, and they were sent on their way. I know it's more complicated than that, but the point is that many of the white people who are pushing this narrative that they have a problem with the immigration of brown people from coming across the southern border, it's amazing because these people are literally the descendants of undocumented immigrants, almost all of them. So the sheer gall and hypocrisy of them condemning brown people for not being documented and wanting to come to this country, that's rich. But that's typical. That's how white supremacy works. White supremacy says that as long as you are of European descent, you are categorized as white, you can do whatever you want. The rules don't apply to you. And then when you have established what it is you want to your benefit, then you can make up the rules for everybody else. And when everybody else tries to do things the way you and your ancestors did it to get the wealth and the and the position that you have, oh no, then other people can't do that. It's not legitimate if other people do it the way that white supremacy means, that white people get to make the rules and move the goalposts whenever they want to, and they're trying to dictate to the other group of oppressed people, the other group of people they have left out of their taking advantage of open borders, because that's what this immigration was from Europe between 1500 to 1965. It was Europeans taking advantage of the open borders of the United States. And now these people are telling black people that we should be against open borders for other people. But they're leaving something else out of this discussion. And that is the very important role that U.S. domestic and foreign policy plays and has played in creating this quote unquote crisis of immigration from Central and Latin America in the first place. Because see, the very same people who are moving the goalposts, making and changing the rules, and telling us who we're supposed to advocate for, or who we're supposed to believe are in this fight with us, or suffering from the same issues that we're suffering from, they're the ones who have benefited from these policies. They're the ones who voted for these people to implement these policies, and they're the ones who celebrated these policies because they believe they got something out of them. But these policies and their implementation are what connects Black people in the United States. And if you want to call us the native-born descendants of slaves, okay, fine, you can. But these policies and how they have impacted Latin and Central American countries are what connects Black people and these immigrants. These white people are telling us, and some Black people are telling us, that we're not supposed to care about. Let me explain to you why. Unfortunately, because of the technical issues, I'm not going to be able to share my screen with you while I read this stuff. But like I always do, I'm going to give you the links to these articles so you can read through them yourself, and you can see that I'm not just making this stuff up. Because what we don't do in Luqman Nation is talk too much about our feelings about things. We have opinions about stuff. We certainly do. And every once in a while, we'll, go off on a rant about how angry something makes us. But we start every discussion, every conversation in Luqman Nation, whether it's here on Coffee, Current Events, and Politics, whether it's on Brick by Brick, whether it's on Pit Bulls and Politics. We start every discussion with facts, with history, with data, with dates, names. And if we get around to talking about how all this stuff makes us feel, okay. But what we seek to do here in Luqman Nation is connect the dots. Because it really is all connected. Black people are not divorced from what's going on at the southern border. Because neoliberal strictures, support for oligarchs, and the war on drugs in the United States have impoverished millions and destabilized Latin America. This is from an article in The Nation magazine. It's from October of last year. And they started off talking about Donald Trump, but these issues predate Donald Trump. See, the debate has been entirely focused on domestic policy, right? How to treat the undocumented when they arrive. And, Democrats thinking that Latinos will vote for them, of course, want the newcomers to stay. And we're seeing some of this in places like Texas, in places like Nevada, in places like Philadelphia, where or Pennsylvania in the midterm elections, where we're seeing the populations shift, the demographics shift to a more Hispanic population. So the Democrats, yeah, they're playing politics with immigrants. Yes, they are. So are the Republicans. Don't think that either side is any more or less guilty of the other than playing politics with people's lives. They do it to us. They pander to us for our vote. The Latinos are just the next one to do it. They're just the next target. So The Nation magazine points to the policies that destabilize Latin America. Lost in these U.S.-centric arguments of employers wanting cheap labor, like we said, workers fear wage competition. For Black workers, there is no wage competition. We get paid less because of racism, without immigrants having to do anything with that. That's always been true. Lost in these U.S.-centric arguments is the role of our foreign policy in creating the conditions that push people in Central America and Mexico to make the long, arduous, and frequently fatal trek north. In the 1980s, Washington and its neoliberal collaborators, that Washington, as in the political entity, Washington, and its neoliberal collaborators began imposing policies that favored multinational corporations and hurt the working poor. You know how we really hate Walmart here in this country, because Walmart tends to take over a market. Same thing with Amazon. Same thing with other big box stores, even though most of them have failed. But the big problem with Walmart is that when Walmart builds a store, and especially a super center in an area, the mom and pop stores that existed before generally close because they can't compete with Walmart's low prices. The same thing happened after the North American Free Trade Agreement, and large US-based multinational corporations moved to Mexico and other Latin American countries for the cheap labor. But those multinational companies put small Mexican and Central American and Latin American farmers and businesses out of business. So the very thing we hate about Walmart doing here, lots of corporations did to Latin and Central America after NAFTA. Oh, NAFTA wasn't just the ramping up of the loss of American jobs. It was also the destabilization of the Latin American and Central American economic markets too. For at least 150 years, the U.S. has also intervened with arms, political pressure, and foreign aid in order to protect the business and military elites of the countries that we destabilize their economies, who have prospered off of us destabilizing their economies and impoverishing the Latin American and Central American people. We are propping up the governments that profit off of us destroying their economies. That's what neoliberalism is. Destroying the public infrastructure that everyone benefits from, that the whole society benefits from, for the profit of a few. Privatizing it, taking the profit away from your average consumer, taking their ability to participate in the market away, privatizing those services for the benefit of the few. We've done that in Central and Latin America. Still, in the 1980s, when this kind of began, illegal immigration from the region remained kind of modest until the mid to late 80s, when the U.S. government and its neoliberal collaborators at the IMF and the World Bank began imposing policies in Latin and Central America that favored these multinational corporations, undercutting the small farms and businesses that had supported the working poor. In 1980, the working poor in Central and Latin America, they didn't have any reason to leave their homes. They were able to make a living. Even though they weren't rich, they weren't trying to get rich, but they were able to support themselves. After the mid to late 80s, they couldn't do that anymore. Meanwhile, many of the oligarchs became partners in the growing narco-trafficking business in these countries. Because, see, late 80s, early 90s was the same time that the rise of an influx of cocaine hit the United States and the crack era started. It is not a coincidence that these things happened at the same time, because the United States was complicit in all of it. Protected by government officials, criminal gangs have spread throughout the region, the Latin and Central American region, adding threats of kidnapping, extortion, rape, and murder to the daily life of people struggling to make a living, already had their economy destroyed by American multinational corporations that wiped out small farmers and businesses, supported the working poor. Now these people are dealing with narco-terrorism. Their countries being run by oligarchs who are in bed with the American government that is propping up these multinational corporations, and who are also in bed with these drug traffickers, cartels, drug gangs, who are murdering people in the streets, raping, kidnapping. This is what people in Central and Latin American countries dealt with because of U.S. foreign policy. And on our end, during that time, we were dealing with the war on drugs that correlated with this rise in narco-terrorism in Latin America and Central America. How did that happen? Why would we be involved in that? Well, the war on drugs provides the same oligarchs with political protection and more weapons. In 2009, now this is way later than the beginning of this cocaine and crack and CIA. We're going to get to that in a minute. But in 2009, the Obama administration ensured the success of a coup by the Honduran military against an elected president, democratically elected president in Honduras. Anybody who has a problem with quote unquote illegal immigration from Latin and Central America, who does not also have a problem with the United States government intervening in a democratically elected, a fair democratic election in another country, are blatant hypocrites. You can't sit here and tell me that you are all about freedom and democracy in the United States, but you don't care that one of the reasons people from Latin and Central America, especially places like Honduras, are fleeing Honduras is because our government overthrew the president they elected to fix their economy with modest social programs of food and education for the poor. The Honduran people elected a president democratically who was going to help the poor people in that country. But that pissed off the ruling class. That pissed off the oligarchs down there. That pissed off the Democrats up here, the ruling class, the oligarchs in the American government. And that included the Obama administration and President Obama. And they backed a coup, so that the oligarchs who are in bed with the narco-terrorists are still in power, still killing people, still raping, still kidnapping. And that's why people are leaving Honduras. So what does this have to do with the war on drugs? Well, do you remember Ronald Reagan and a little thing called the Iran-Contra affair? Ronald Reagan's efforts to eradicate communism spanned the globe, but the insurgent Contras cause in Nicaragua, another Central American country, was particularly dear to him because, see, the Cuban-backed Sandinistas, the Republicans hated the Cubans. Well, I should say the conservatives hated the Cubans because a whole lot of Democrats hated the Cubans too, because the Cuban Revolution was a socialist, communist kind of revolution where the people kicked the oligarchy out of Cuba. And a lot of that oligarchy were American companies. And the revolution resulted in the nationalization of those companies. And Cuba did not end up poor because communism is bad or because socialism is bad or because Fidel Castro was bad. Cuba ended up poor because the United States implemented an embargo against trade with Cuba. So there were no countries that were U.S. allies that were basically allowed to trade with Cuba. So the United States literally tried to starve Cuba to death. The only country, one of the only countries that would help Cuba was Russia. And Cuba didn't even want to work with them, but they didn't have any choice because the United States practically cut them off from trade with every other country in the world. Why? Because the people took their country back from the American corporations and the oligarchs. So the Cubans backed the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Reagan and the conservatives couldn't have another Cuba on their hands in Nicaragua. So Reagan and the conservatives backed the Contras. And the Contras, according to Ronald Reagan, were the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. The whole mythology around the Contras in Nicaragua, you've got to go back and look at some of the C-SPAN footage and find some of the footage. They just made these people out to be just, saints. But they were murderers. So Reagan had the Reagan Doctrine, where the CIA trained and assisted Contras and other anti-communist insurgents around the world. In 1985, this is where Iran comes in. Now, these are the very same people who are demonizing Iran and talking about Iran as the biggest threat in the Middle East. This is why history is extremely, extremely important when you're talking about policy, domestic and foreign policy. Because in 1985, while Iran and Iraq were at war, Iran made a secret request to buy weapons from us, the United States. That's right. In spite of the embargo of selling arms to Iran, the sale of arms was thought to not only improve U.S. relations with Iran. See, St. Reagan was even open to making nice with Iran. But they thought it might in turn lead to improved relations with Lebanon. There was a time that even conservatives thought, look, maybe we can make some kinds of deals with these people. And eventually arms were sold. We did sell arms to Iran during an embargo. This is where the Iran-Contra scandal comes from. Because while the sale of arms to Iran was supposed to fund the Contras, they, of course, needed more money. So it was found at some point that all of the money that came from Iran didn't all go to the Contras. But there was this guy, Oliver North, who headed this humanitarian organization that was supposed to be conducting or coordinating humanitarian aid for the Contras in Honduras. And there was all this money that was coming in, but it wasn't all being accounted for. There started to be rumors floating around that not only were the Contras involved in cocaine smuggling, and I mean massive amounts of cocaine, not like you see on Queen of the South, right? Like people swallowing little balloons of cocaine and swallowing like 5 or 10 of them and smuggling them across the border through tunnels. No, we're talking about Manuel Noriega and others being involved in smuggling ships of cocaine, like cargo ships. I don't mean pleasure yachts, cargo ships of cocaine. Not only was the cocaine trafficking said to have been done by cargo ships, but they were also said to have been done by plane. And that's very important because the humanitarian aid was supposed to be coordinated by lots of airdrops, planes that were piloted by CIA agents or CIA contractors. The allegations started to float around that some of those CIA contractors and a few agents were actually trafficking cocaine. They weren't just flying aid from the United States and other countries to Nicaragua to help the Contras. No, they were exchanging aid for cocaine and flying it into the United States, flying it into United States military bases. Now, there has never been any concrete evidence like pictures, but there was a reporter named Gary Webb who began to connect the dots. He began to connect the dots of these massive shipments of cocaine that were showing up on the at the ports in Los Angeles. And then he was also seeing an influx of cocaine in this new drug called crack that started showing up in poor Black and Latino neighborhoods in Los Angeles. All at the same time, there was all this missing money and this massive operation that the United States government, under the Reagan administration, was conducting to help the Contras by selling arms to Iran and providing the Contras humanitarian aid. Something was missing, something wasn't right. There was no logical explanation for this enormous influx of drugs into Los Angeles. And Gary Webb actually wrote a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News called Dark Alliance, where he started to connect these dots. Now, people came out and said that Webb made this stuff up, that he didn't have any evidence, but Webb got a hold of documents that were classified that cast very long shadows on, if not the direct involvement of some CIA agents and contractors, it absolutely called into question the lack of oversight that the CIA had over Oliver North and this operation, and the lack of oversight Oliver North had. The lack of oversight was so bad. Now, in this other article from WETA, it's called Cocaine Conspiracy Theories and the CIA in Central America. They say that amongst Webb's fundamental problems was his implication that the CIA lit the crack cocaine fuse. It was conspiracy theory, a neat presentation of reality that simply didn't jibe with real life. Webb later agreed in an interview that there was no hard evidence that the CIA as an institution or any of its agent employees, the direct employees of the CIA, carried out or profited from drug trafficking. Still, the fantastic story of the CIA injecting crack into ghettos had taken hold. In response to the public outcry following Webb's allegations, which were ultimately published in a book form under the title Dark Alliance, the CIA conducted an internal investigation of its role in Central America related to the drug trade. Frederick Hidds, as the CIA Inspector General, an independent watchdog approved by Congress, conducted the investigation. In October 1998, the CIA released a declassified version of Hidds' two-volume report. The IG report, now this is very important, the IG report cleared the CIA as an organization of complicity with the inner-city crack cocaine trade. It refuted charges that CIA officials, the top brass at the CIA, knew that their Nicaraguan allies were dealing drugs. The report didn't say that the Nicaraguans were not dealing drugs, that the Contras were not dealing drugs. The report just refuted that the CIA officials knew it. But the report said that the CIA, in a number of cases, didn't bother to look into allegations about narcotics. And the HITS report describes how there was little or no direction for CIA operatives when confronted by the rampant traffic in drugs in Central America during the 1980s. I'm going to give you a link to this too. This is very, very interesting because I remember people in my neighborhood. I grew up here in Southeast DC, predominantly Black, predominantly poor. I remember what this neighborhood was like before crack. And it was very different. It was a great place to grow up for a kid, even if you were poor. We didn't know we were poor. We were just kids. But then crack happened, and this neighborhood changed drastically. And people who served in Vietnam and knew the role that the United States government played in trafficking heroin from Vietnam immediately knew that the United States government was somehow involved in this massive influx of this new drug that nobody had seen before, along with guns hitting the streets of our neighborhood. We knew. And I have to admit, even then, I didn't believe those people. I didn't believe some of those people were like, oh my God, the CIA. And they specifically mentioned the CIA because the CIA's business is to carry out the United States foreign policy around the world. And that means regime change. That means destabilizing governments. That means toppling democratically elected leaders that the United States doesn't like. That means covert operations. The United States, or the CIA rather, this is their business. And people have seen this before. But I have to admit, I didn't believe it at first. I had to get a little bit older, and I had to connect the dots myself. So here you have, excuse me, I have to look at the date of this broadcast. I don't see the date on it, but this looks like this was from like maybe 1990 or so. It's pretty old. But I do have an article from Newsweek magazine in 1996 that asks, was the CIA involved in the crack epidemic? See, the United States government has been involved in making money for its allies any way that it could. They didn't have a problem selling arms to their sworn enemy, Iran. And as long as boats loads, ships loads, plane loads of money came in that they could give to the Contras, they didn't really care where that money came from. The CIA, all the officials knew. I don't care what the IG report said. Of course, they're not going to put in the IG report that the CIA officials, that the CIA top brass knew about the Nicaraguan Contra drug trafficking. Of course, they're not going to put that in the report. But do you really believe that an organization that nobody really knows how much money they get in our taxes, they don't have to report really to anybody publicly? And they're not even the most secret organization, intelligence organization in this country. But they basically have carte blanche to go around the world and murder people on behalf of the United States government. And I mean murder leaders, democratically elected leaders, and the leaders and members of popular resistances and revolutionary movements in other countries. You don't know these people who have that kind of apparatus and infrastructure. You don't think they knew that the Contras were trafficking in narcotics? If you believe in Pizzagate today, but you don't believe the CIA knew that the Contras were a bunch of drug traffickers, then you're a hypocrite. So, black people, during the height of the crack epidemic, during the height of the war on drugs, we are suffering mass incarceration because of the war on drugs in disproportionate numbers, more than any other group of people. Latinos probably second after us, Native Americans probably third after us, then poor white people, but black people disproportionately affected and targeted by the war on drugs during the crack era. Black people disproportionately targeted by law enforcement to be policed, stop and frisk, rose during that time. There was always some manner of stop and frisk or stop and show me your papers that black people and Native people and Latinos had to live with in this country. But stop and frisk became a codified policy in many places during the war on drugs. The 1994 crime bill was a response to the war on drugs. It was a part of the war on drugs where black people were asking for help. Yes, we were asking for law enforcement help with violent criminals, not non-violent drug possession offenders. We're talking about, we wanted people who were killing people to be taken off the streets and locked up. What we got instead of that, and mental health treatment and drug treatment and federally funded mental health facilities that were closed, and money for summer jobs programs that had been taken away, and equitable funding for public schools in our neighborhoods. What we got instead was more policing, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline. At the same time the war on drugs was going on, targeting us here, the United States government was deploying the CIA to continue to work with people like the Contras and other narco-terrorists in Latin and Central America who were shipping the drugs to the United States. The United States, the country full of people who do not want to vote for policies that will provide free health care, free mental health support, free drug treatment, after school programs, equitable and fair public school funding, job programs, quality affordable housing, a strong social safety net. The United States, full of people who don't want to vote for policies that will help poor people, is the largest consumer for the drug trade and the drug traffickers that this government is supporting in Central and Latin America. You don't think the plight that black people face here in this country is connected to what people in Latin and Central America are fleeing from? It's directly related. And please understand, you all, I'm not saying that it's our fault that they're fleeing from their country. No, what I am saying is that black people in America are the victims of the exact same people and policies that Latin and Central American immigrants are victims of. We are victims and targets of the same people, the same policies. The United States government, the war on drugs, NAFTA. This article from Newsweek magazine, 1996, asks, was the CIA involved in the crack epidemic? They talk also about Gary Webb, and there's a movie starring Jeremy Renner. He's one of my secret crushes. He probably did something horrible at some point in his life, and I'm gonna have to kick him to the curb. But right now, he's one of my secret white boy crushes. Called Kill the Messenger. You can get that movie on Netflix if you can find it on YouTube. I highly suggest you watch that movie. You want to talk about Hillary Clinton and her alleged hit squad knocking people off who say mean things about her, who allege that she was involved in a child sex trafficking ring. How about Gary Webb, the author of the San Jose Mercury News series about the CIA crack Iran-Contra connection, the author of the book Dark Alliance, who was just soundly repudiated by the journalistic community. He was an outcast. They trashed that man's name. He allegedly committed suicide, but he was found with 2 gunshots to the head. So this article in 1996 talks about Gary Webb's Dark Alliance book and the series in San Jose Mercury News. Also talks about Freeway Ricky Ross, who created one of South Central's biggest crack distribution rings in the early 1980s. As Webb tells it, Ross built his empire on an abundant supply of cheap cocaine provided by 2 Nicaraguan refugees, Oscar Danilo Blandon and Juan Norwin Meneses. Now, listen, I'm not sitting here making excuses for American drug kingpins. I am saying, though, that we don't own planes. Black people don't own airplanes. We don't own cargo ships where we can go to anybody's country and import tons and tons, kilos and kilos of drugs. We can distribute it once it gets here, but we economically do not have the apparatus and infrastructure to get it from another country to here. You need a government to do that. You need a government to look the other way. You need a government to give you money to pay customs enough to look the other way. Do you understand how big this is? For a government that is very rich and very powerful not to have been involved? Though Meneses denies it, Blandon said they trafficked in cocaine to raise money for the Contra cause. This was published in Newsweek in 1996. According to the series, Blandon was, quote, the Johnny Appleseed of crack in California. Blandon said he sold cocaine, trafficked cocaine to the United States to raise money for the Contras. Do you really think the CIA didn't know? Distributing thousands of kilos of Colombian cocaine to black dealers like Ricky Ross. Enter the CIA, which at the strenuous urging of its director, the late William Casey, was covertly supporting the war in Nicaragua during the early 80s. That Casey was willing to flout the law is beyond dispute. We all know, go back and look up William Casey. He's a criminal. His obsession with the Sandinistas later led to the Iran-Contra scandal. Webb, citing an array of previously secret reports and sources, suggests that the CIA must have been aware of the Nicaraguan connection. This was too big. This was too big, and there was no way for them not to have known. It was impossible for the CIA not to have known. The Nicaraguan connection reportedly included shipments aboard Salvadorian Air Force planes to an unnamed Air Force base in Texas. But that is Webb's supposition. He doesn't say anyone in the CIA actually knew about we talked about that. So it comes down to these familiar questions. This is directly from the Newsweek article. How much did the CIA know, and when did it know it? Black opinion leaders like Maxine Waters have mounted a furious campaign to force the agency to tell everything it knows. A panel discussion on the Mercury News series drew an overflow crowd at the Washington Convention Center on September 12, and comedian Dick Gregory and NAACP board member Joseph Madison were arrested during a demonstration at CIA headquarters on September 11th. This was 1996, and I remember that, actually. There's a further twist. A decade after he allegedly retired from the crack business, Ricky Ross was set up. He had retired now, wasn't involved in the crack game anymore for a decade, but he was set up by a DEA informant. Who? Danilo Blandon. At the time, Ross faced life in prison, while Blandon, who served 26 months in jail for his own career in drug trafficking, was free in Managua. So Newsweek even asked the question, was the CIA involved in the crack epidemic? Of course, Newsweek couldn't answer the question because neither Gary Webb said that anybody personally at the CIA was involved. Nowhere in his series did he name anybody in the CIA who was involved. But again, with all the information we have now, which is much more information that we had access to back then when the series came out, when the book came out, there is no way the CIA did not know, was not involved, didn't look the other way, didn't pay money, didn't receive these shipments, didn't receive that. There's no way. There's no way Oliver North didn't know. Oliver North, again, remember.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I got something about Oliver North where the National Security Archive obtained handwritten notebooks of Oliver North with the details.
That's right. Now, unfortunately, you guys, because of the tech issues, I can't turn on hubby's camera. So you're just going to have to hear his sexy voice. Yes.
Okay, it says the National Security Archive obtained the handwritten notebooks of Oliver North, the National Security Council aide who helped run the Contra War and other Reagan administration covert operations through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed in 1989. The notebooks, as well as declassified memos sent to North, record that North was repeatedly informed of Contra ties to drug trafficking. In his entry for August 9th, 1985, North summarizes a meeting with Robert Owen, his liaison with the Contras. They discuss a plane used by Mario Calero, brother of Adolfo Calero, head of the FDN, to transport supplies from New Orleans to Contras in Honduras. North writes, quote, Honduran DC-6, which is being used for runouts of New Orleans, is probably being used for drug runs into U.S. As Lorraine Adams reported in the October 22nd, 1994 Washington Post, there are no records that corroborate North's later assertion that he passed this intelligence on drug trafficking to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, which he claimed, but there's no record that he did that.
Exactly. Oliver North, who later became a conservative Christian hero. I remember that man being invited to speak at conservative, at politically conservative white churches in the area. And it made me sick. It made me so sick and disgusted. But Oliver North knew that the Contras were drug traffickers. And the money that he was getting came from drug trafficking. He knew it. So this whole war on drugs This whole war on drugs and the 94 crime bill and the mass incarceration of the school to prison pipeline and the mandatory minimums and the stop and frisk and the destruction of black neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods in the United States due to crack. The demonization of our children as super predators. The lie of the crack baby.
Yeah, I mean, the breakups of black families just due to it, you know, by itself.
The targeting of black men.
Yep.
During this time. And taking black men out of our neighborhoods, out of our communities, all through this war on drugs, through mass incarceration. The lack of mental health support, the lack of drug treatment that was free, that should have been free, because we pay taxes too. All of that, black people in America were suffering because the Reagan administration, the CIA, Oliver North, William Casey decided to make money for the Contras through drug trafficking.
And there's one thing here left, just so that we can bring the point home. Mm-hmm. On July 28th, 1988. So don't tell me that the government didn't know, you know, what was going on. 2 DEA agents testified before the House Subcommittee on Crime regarding a sting operation conducted against the Medellin cartel. Mm-hmm. The 2 agents said that in 1985, Oliver North had wanted to take $1.5 million in cartel bribe money that was carried by a DEA informant and give it to the Contras. DEA officials rejected the idea. Mm-hmm. The Kerry Committee report concluded that senior U.S. policymakers were not immune to the idea that drug money was a perfect solution to the Contras funding problems.
Who was Kerry? That was John Kerry.
John Kerry.
Senator John Kerry, who actually did conduct an investigation, produced a report, found that there was no way U.S. officials didn't know, and you know what was done about it? Not a damn thing. Not a damn thing. Nobody has paid for what was done to poor black and poor Latino neighborhoods during the crack epidemic. Nobody has paid for that. But you know what happened? You know who else suffered? The citizens of Nicaragua, the citizens of Honduras, and the citizens of Mexico and other Latin and Central American countries that have been under the control of the narco-terrorists that the United States government and the CIA have been in bed with. That's why those people are coming from those countries, because there is literally nothing left for them. NAFTA took away their jobs too, their subsistence farms, their businesses that were supporting the working poor in those countries. When American multinational companies moved to Mexico and Latin American countries for the cheap labor, put all the farmers, small business owners out of business down there. And then the only way people had to make money was to work for the drug traffickers and the cartels. And the cartels made so much money working with the United States government to keep their governments destabilized that they were able to buy control of their governments. And now the cartels control these governments. And the United States is still involved in intervening in these countries. That's why people are leaving Latin American countries. It is not because that they see America as some, that they're sitting down there and they're jealous of our freedoms. No, they don't want to be killed. They don't want to be murdered by the narco-terrorists. They don't want to work for the cartels. They don't want their children to be raped and kidnapped by the cartels. They don't want to get involved in the drug trade. But there's nothing else. Because if they deny the cartels, then they die. I mean, and again, I'm so sorry that our tech is not working correctly today, because I have a great graphic, and I'm going to share it with you. 56 U.S. military interventions in Latin America. 56 since 1890. That's how long the United States has been meddling in Latin American countries. Did you have something over there?
Yeah. Remember we talked about earlier about the lithium connection?
Yes.
Right. So I have an article here that says, is U.S. funded destabilization in Latin America now paying off?
Mm-hmm.
And what they're talking about is the fact that lithium, which is a mineral that's used in batteries, and
right,
that Venezuela, Bolivia, and I think the Colombia, Peru, but it's rich in lithium.
Right.
Well, the United States corporations have now the preconditions for regime change, according to this article, is so that American corporations that have access to the lithium in Venezuela. And we know that Venezuela right now is going through an economic crisis.
Right.
To the point where they have hyperinflation and all this other kind of stuff. They've been trying to get the Bolivian president out of there, but the people love him so much. And so they said here that the favorite demonization is to label the target government. This is how they're doing it. The favorite demonization is to label the target government as a totalitarian dictatorship, or in the process of becoming so unless stopped. This is coupled with regular official condemnatory statements of the target government from the U.S. State Department and a barrage of U.S. official bodies. In the regime change narrative, the ousting of the target government being the cause of civil society's rebellion is fully justified. Thus, for example, the highly illustrative New York Times editorial of April 13, 2002, this article was written in 2016, on occasion of the brief ousting of Hugo Chavez, saying that Venezuela democracy is no longer threatened by a would-be dictator. So this is what they're putting out. But they go on to say, if I can find it, let's see. Yeah, here it is. They said that that by substantially reducing, this is how they're doing it. They said that Brazil all the way through Venezuela is rich in lithium, and American companies have been eyeing it for a couple of decades. So we're seeing that this destabilization for minerals, the same way they're doing in Africa, and the upheaval that it's causing is what is also driving migration up this way.
Exactly. Now, here's a question when it comes to the United States eyeing the lithium in Latin American countries. How is it that Germany and Japan have been able, because obviously, like we said earlier, the United States is eventually going to have to get away from fossil fuels, and the automakers know this. So, of course, they're looking at a market for where they're going to get the materials for their massive electric car fleet that we're going to have to go to. But how is it that Germany and Japan have managed to convert to largely electric, or at least other types of non-fossil fuel engines for their autos without destabilizing Latin American countries? And what is it that you said earlier? That's the difference.
Yeah, because they're paying for it.
Yeah,
I mean, Japan and Germany, they're paying for the lithium, where the United States, they just want it. And anytime you have resources under the feet of brown and black people, United States government and British too, the white supremacist governments, they feel like they just can get it and not pay for it. As Dr. John Henry Clark said, even with regards to Africa, he said, Africa is a place where everybody wants something, but they don't want to pay for it.
But they don't want to pay for it. And the same is true in Latin American countries that are rich in minerals or oil or anything that the United States wants. So this graphic that we're going to share with you, I'm just going to read to you, excuse me, the result of the military interventions in the Central American countries, where we are seeing the greatest percentage of immigrants today. El Salvador, there were two marked military interventions between 1981 and 1992, where the U.S. funds and directs still death squads to crush popular people's movement, killing 75,000 people. The United States funded 2 coups in El Salvador, killed 75,000 people, destroyed the movement. Honduras, U.S.-backed coup in 2009, removed democratically elected president. We talked about that. Nicaragua, 1981 to 1990, the CIA funds and directs Contras and their death squads, I told you they were murderers, against Popular People's Movement, the Sandinistas, murdering 50,000 and destroying the movement. Guatemala, 1954. CIA directs bombing, invasion, and coup after newly elected government nationalizes United Fruit Company lands. That's what it was. Killing, listen to this, 200,000 people. Is that 200,000 or is that 2 million? Wait a minute. Let me look at that.
200,000.
Okay, that's 200,000. Guatemala, 1954. CIA bombed Guatemala because they nationalized United Fruit Company lands. Killed 250,000 people. These are the military interventions, or the interventions that the United States government, either directly through the Department of Defense or covertly through the CIA, have been involved with in the Central American companies where these brown people who we don't want to let into this country are coming from. We created this, not we. They, the United States government created, because black people didn't create this. But for black people to think that we don't have anything to do with the immigrants, or for black people to think that the immigrants have nothing to do with black people and what we are suffering in this country, we do not understand our history. And now we're not even talking about history from 100 years ago. We're talking about 30 years.
Yeah, a couple of decades.
30 years. There's no way any black person in this country who lives in a poor neighborhood, who understands what crack did to it, can sit there and say, look at what my government did to my community with this crack, and not understand that the same crack that destroyed our neighborhoods is the same crack that's destroying Central America and forcing those people out of their homes because they don't have a home anymore. What they have are killing fields, and there are killing fields that the United States has created.
And I think that also that we have to understand, as we always say on this show, is that the government does this because the government is doing all of this stuff based off our tax dollar.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
So when we see these things that's happening and the injustices that this government is doing, then we have to ask ourselves that if we silently, as the citizenry, sit by and allow the government, after we know about it, and say that we don't have anything to do with it, well, they're doing this being funded by our tax dollar. So, I mean, like I said before, and people didn't like it, but I mean, there is no such thing as innocent civilians.
Listen,
you know what I mean? Not coming from America anyway. And if you're from those countries, just like if you're from one of those Middle East countries that was the victim of excessive bombing, drones and stuff, and I mean, how can you seriously say that when you want revenge, that you're going to distinguish between the guilty and the innocent in America, when the American military doesn't do it.
Exactly. Do you really believe that when the CIA bombed Guatemala, they picked out, okay, that group of people over there, we don't want to bomb them, so let's move them out of the way. Let's make sure we only bomb 200,000 guilty people. Please, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
No, that's what they tell us.
That's what they tell us, but we know that's not how any of this works. So listen, in this whole immigration discussion, people who today are talking about, I don't understand how you can be for open borders. Only the liberals are for open borders. Every white person who is the descendant of someone who came from Europe is beneficiary of America's open borders before 1965. Every single one of them. Please remember that fact. The next time you hear one of those people say something crazy about open borders, I'm not for open borders. Well, your grandpa was, because that's how he came here.
There was no wall at Ellis Island.
There wasn't a wall at Ellis Island. There was a statue with a torch that said, "Bring me your," what does it say? You're tired and poor, and that was supposed to have been dedicated to freeing the enslaved Africans, and they covered her shackles up.
Sure did.
So anybody, and especially a white person. Christopher McMillan said CIA, capitalist invisible army. That's perfect. That's perfect. That is exactly what it is. Anybody who sits there and talk about, I'm not for open borders, if that person is white, then open borders was how their grandparents and great-grandparents got here.
Well, the first thing that destroyed open borders is technology. There's no such thing as a nation state anymore.
No, that there isn't. No, and for Black people in particular, who have a problem with immigrants, these immigrants from Central and Latin American countries, especially, saying that these are the people that we don't care about these people, and these are the people who are taking our jobs, and they're making our unemployment worse. Black people were being discriminated against in the job market in this country before the first Latin American country was bombed. White supremacy and racist practices in employment, hiring, and compensation have always kept Black people at the bottom of the barrel. Immigrants didn't do that. Our government did that. White business owners did that. White union bosses did that, keeping Black people out of unions. Mm-hmm. So this discussion that people or this narrative people have that Black people have that they don't have anything to do with Black people, that with the immigrants, and the immigrants are making it harder for Black people. There is nobody that can make the plight of Black people any harder than it is.
That's just Black people.
We've shown you the data about what has already been done to Black people. Immigrants didn't do any of that. Well, not these immigrants. Those descendants of the open borders from Granville, they did, but not these immigrants coming from the southern border. And if you are a poor Black person, you don't even have to be poor. If you are a Black person who has had any kind of experience in contact with the war on drugs in any form at all, if it has affected you in any way, then you really need to understand that those people who are coming from Central and Latin American countries, they not only had nothing to do with it, but they are the other victims of it. They are the victims of the U.S. foreign policy that's the companion to it.
And the thing that we have to understand is that the drug crisis is hitting them hard too. You got places in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia where they got kids as young as 6, 7 years old and stuff getting high, what they call off the cocoa paste.
Right.
You know
right.
What I mean? Yeah. And
exactly.
And it's so how can I put it? It's so bad that when they don't get it,
Mm-hmm.
some of them even chew their fingers off.
Right.
Other kind.
Right.
So, and then the fact is, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Jackie, is that because America, through its own selfish national interest, have basically destroyed the economies down there. The book we were talking about earlier about the Confessions of Economic Hitman.
Oh yes, that's what I forgot.
And I would really encourage everyone to get that book. But this was a guy who was in the inner workings of the government. He was an economic hitman, and he still is in hiding because they're out to get him.
Right.
And he details in the book how it was U.S. government policy to send people like him to these leaders and say either you do our bidding or you don't lead, or you don't rule anymore, or you might get a bullet.
Right.
You know, so we have to understand that with all of this destabilization, we see it with Venezuela right now. We see it with they tried to do it with Cuba for 30 years with the embargo.
Right.
And so what happens is that the cartels are like the only employer in town. You know, and they're the only employer in town. The gangs are the only employers. And so, I mean, people don't leave their homes just for the hell of it.
Right.
If you were born and raised in Guatemala, that's your home.
Exactly.
All we got to do, we have to understand, we have to think of people like ourselves. Like, people are people. If you grew up in DC, I grew up in New Jersey, whatever. I mean, normally you won't leave there.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's your home. You know what I mean? So we have to understand that these people are fleeing here not because, as we heard earlier on talk radio, that our way of life is better. Right. No, they're
the superior American.
They're fleeing here because we have made it. The government of the United States and not just the United States, Europe, you know, Britain, the old colonialists, I always call them. They made life miserable for those people down there. Right. So that's the reason why that they're fleeing up this way. You know what I mean?
And for one oppressed group of people, you know, black, native-born descendants of slaves, like I said, if that's the term you want to use, fine. But for one oppressed group of people to look at another oppressed group of people who are being impacted by the exact same people and the exact same policies, just in different ways, and say, I don't care about what the people that are oppressing both of us does to you, that's some messed up, sick stuff. And we just don't subscribe to that here in Luqman Nation. And I'm just going to wrap this up. I'm not saying that we need to put the interests of other groups of people before the interests of black people. We are going to advocate for black people first all day, every day. That is just true. And if people don't like that, you don't have to stay on this page. But what we are not going to do while we are advocating for black people is act as if other people are not impacted in horrible ways by a common enemy using common tools. And we're not going to act as if we are alone in this fight, even if those people who are trying to come into this country have no idea how much in common they have with us. Not yet.
But but they won't know if we won't engage them.
Exactly.
And then number two is that we have to understand as black people in this country that what's happening to them, to the immigrants, is the same system that is making life miserable for them, that make them feel up here. The same system that keeps us oppressed is white supremacy.
Exactly.
We are both all victims of white supremacy, and it's that system that has to be dismantled.
Right. So, y'all, thank y'all so much for joining us tonight. Finally, when I finally was able to get something working, and we were able to do this episode. If you like what you heard tonight,
and I know you did,
I mean, come on. Even with stuff not working, I poured my heart and soul into this. And then hubby came in at the last, at the last end, and he gave his pearls of wisdom. Come on now. If you don't share this video with some of your black friends who you've heard this mess from. And listen, again, this isn't a dig at any particular person. because we've heard this sentiment from different people.
Yeah.
And it's thinking that we have to stop thinking myopically. We have to start understanding the role of policy in not just what happens to us, but how it impacts other people. And we got to talk. We got to focus on who our real enemy is. Our enemy is not those immigrants. It's not. Our enemy is white supremacy, and our enemy is this government. If we really have a problem with immigration, we would target these policies and politicians who are propping up this system of imperialism and foreign intervention, destabilizing countries. If you're really pissed off at immigration, cut it off at the head or the root, however you want to look at it.
If you want to stop immigration, and I like what you said because that's just common sense, something that the government doesn't know much about. But if you want to stop immigration, then make the people's home livable. Leave them alone.
Thank you.
Then they won't have to come here.
Thank you. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. As I said, share this video. Subscribe to us on YouTube if you have not subscribed. Invite your friends to subscribe. Invite people you don't like to subscribe. Consider becoming a patron with monthly contributions, or consider a one-time donation to support Luqman Nation. You can find us on Patreon and GoFundMe and PayPal, searching for Luqman Nation. Follow us on Facebook. Like us. What do you do on Twitter? Do you follow people on Twitter? I guess you follow. We're not on Twitter much because it's just too much to do, but you can follow us on Twitter. Check us out on Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou on Sputnik, where we have a weekly midterm election roundup segment that should be up and available on the Sputnik site. We will have a link for that on our Facebook page and on Twitter. Check us out on most Saturday nights between 9:30ish for Pitbull and Politics. If you think this is raw, come check us out on Spreaker Saturday nights. And that's even more raw. For lighter fare, friends of Coffee, Current Events, and Politics.
That's our community page. On
our community page on Facebook. I am tired of talking. Thank you all so much for joining us. Check us again next week. As always, be good to each other. Peace.
Peace.